Hello and welcome to In Conversation With, the Siemens podcast that delves into the role of technology in driving sustainable economies. Here we discuss cutting-edge innovations, industry trends, and strategies shaping a greener, more resilient future. My name is Buitemela Masike and I'm your host. In today's episode, we're discussing the rise of green industries and technology. If you missed our previous episode, this is part 2 of our climate impact conversation. We're in conversation with Sabine Dall'Omo, CEO of Siemens Sub-Saharan Africa, in studio to help us unpack this topic. Can we talk about green industries and technology? I feel like it's a fairly new term. What is it exactly?
The green industries, when you look at the definition of what it means, it's basically industries which are mitigating the effect of climate change, reducing through their activities the use of resources, but also avoiding rapid industrialization through the means as we have seen that in previous decades.
Can you provide the current state of green industries and technologies in the context of combating climate change here in Africa and in South Africa?
For the industries, I think we'll need to look into the individual verticals because they're all different developed. So maybe looking at renewable energy, there we see quite a bit of progress. I mean, specifically in South Africa, because with the amount of renewable energy we all have added to our houses, but also projects as bigger independent power producer came along, feeding into the grid, and it's also helped to offset the impacts of load shedding in South Africa. But we see as well renewable energy projects all over the continent. If you think, for instance, Kenya, they have this massive Lake Turkana wind farm. You have in Kenya 90% of all the energy they produce, same for Rwanda, is green because they have hydro dams or they have geothermal technology. Same is valid for Ethiopia. They work with a big hydro dam, the GERD, the Great Renaissance Dam, producing up to 6,000 megawatt of capacity. And so you have different forms of renewable energy which are already implemented and making the contribution to mitigate the effect of climate change and reducing the CO2 emissions out of energy for industrial activities, but also for private activities significantly.
I just want to get into how we're mitigating climate change on a global scale.
When we look on a global scale, most of the mitigation which is put forward is on CO2 reduction. Yeah? So a lot of effort goes into what produces CO2, and there are two main factors. One is the way on how the Western world lives in buildings, and that means heating and cooling. And the other part is particular the energy generation, which is largely fossil fueled, be it gas, diesel, in the South African example, for instance, coal. And so reducing these kind of fossil fuels out of the energy production, that are the two main aims currently worked on. And that goes along with, as we discussed before, the low carbon transportation. So seeing, how you can take carbon out of, for instance, the transport industry, be it electrify railways, which then, if you have green energy in your network, would be fed by green energy, using, for instance, hydrogen trains and different gases, because not every industry can be decarbonized in the context of that they can have a solar plant and they have a solar battery. Some of the industry, if you think about glass, steel, they need lots of heat on a high temperature, and that normally you achieve with fossil fuels, or in that case, often with gas. And so to decarbonize such an industry, you would need to have a replacement, maybe in the form of hydrogen.
Do you think the Africa region is on its way towards greener industries?
To an extent, yes. When we look at power in South Africa, for instance, we see that the renewable energy, specifically solar and wind, are much more cost effective than building new power plants, specifically when they have cost overruns like we see in Kusile and Medupi. So the cost per kilowatt hour is cheaper. They are quicker available because, like a solar plant, you can, set up between 6 and 9 months from groundbreaking to completion. You have other countries like, for instance, Kenya, where they have geothermal energy available, and a country which doesn't have coal like us, they would need to import anything like it or any other commodity they need for a fossil fuel plant. So for them, it really makes sense to say we take what we have. It's, again, reasoning for cost purpose. The same is with some of the hydro plants which we see all over the continent, in Ethiopia, in the DRC, in Zambia, because the river is there. It's not used for shipping, for instance, and they have the possibility to maximize the use of the water resource. And so therefore, to ensure solid base power, we see more renewable projects coming along. And one thing what we also see, and that is driven by the decision taken last year in November during COP28 in Dubai, that there will be a gradually step out of fossil fuels.
Can I just go back just a little bit? Because you mentioned the topic of e-waste. How do we dispose of electronic waste in South Africa and in Africa?
Yeah, in South Africa, we have a regulation since 2022, May 2022. It's called the Extended Producer Responsibility for Electrical Products. And in that context, there are recycling companies. So if you deal with electrical products, you import electrical products. It can be like, in our case, for instance, PLCs or switchgears, but it can also be your toaster or your TV. So depending on what kind of product you are dealing with, there are dedicated recyclers in the country. You would provide to your end customer the possibility to contact them and pick up the product or recycle the product, or you drop it off yourself. And subject to the use of these kind of services is that you're part of one of the agencies, an organization, in our case is called Circular Energy, and they are coordinating the efforts of these recycling companies and making sure, that they have certain health and safety standards and so on. And in these recycling companies, they are taking then the product apart into the components and see that, most of the product make, for instance, electronics, but, also glass and plastic is split into the components and then put into the individual recycling or repurpose process, ideally in the context of a circular economy. So it's going back to the value chain.
I want to just quickly go into the importance of why households as well need to dispose of their electronic waste.
Well, the reason is relatively simple, because in any electronic product, be it your cell phone or your TV or a computer, you have certain minerals and poisons within the computer, like the semiconductors which are in and the screens or lithium batteries, And if you just waste it, dump it into the normal rubbish bin, it's problematic because it's polluting the water, and so you pollute the groundwater, which in large areas is a basis for providing people with drinking water, and so if you poison them, you will have all kind of other diseases coming along, depending on what kind of toxic substance maybe went into the water body. On the other hand, it's also difficult for some of the components to actually be processed through time by the natural recycling. So having it recycled for once is important, that you avoid any negative impact to the environment.
I'm happy that we highlighted the importance of e-waste disposal, especially I want to encourage our listeners to dispose of their waste in a safe manner. Thank you so much for that. I just want to know, how can governments and policy makers support the development and adoption of green industries and technologies?
One part which is important in South Africa is quite ahead in comparison to the other African countries, because we have with Barbara Creasy a very active minister in the respective field, which is also, looking at the attributes in a savvy manner. So legislation around the circular economy and the legislation which we have seen, which we just spoke about, which has been implemented in South Africa is vital, because you need to have rather an incentive or a punishment system for industry to follow a legislation. And the same is now valid, for instance, for CO2 emissions. So South Africa has put into their legislation the commitments they have made at the various COP conferences. And so they have moved that into legislative material, and therefore we have a CO2 tax, for instance, to make sure that people are incentivized to reduce carbon emissions.
What role do you think businesses and corporations play in advancing green technologies and sustainability initiatives?
For business, there are two vital aspects, which, beside collaborating with government, is one part. But I think as a business, and when we also zoom in of what Siemens does, first of all, as a company which exists already since more than 175 years globally, we want to be another 175 years around, and so we need to make sure through our action that the planet is preserved, because we have only one planet. And the other part is that through that venture, we need to ensure that our own activities, decarbonized, environmental friendly, less water consumption. And if we zoom in now into our own activities here in Siemens, in South Africa, we have, for instance, 59% of our waste, which we produce, is recycled. We have reduced our water consumption by more than 50% over the last 3 years, because we changed the way and how we work our premises. We have added 1 megawatt of electricity from solar energy on our parking lot to ensure, we can have e-cars which are green. So it's all the things we do ourselves to ensure that we work in the context of what is a sustainable environmental and governance role. And as global industry in general, as you see, there are a whole host of initiatives, like, for instance, RE100. This is Renewable Energy 100, where a whole host of companies, global companies, have signed up to be 100% green when it comes to energy consumption in their global footprint.
I hope South Africa gets to a point where we're able to grow and sustain our green initiatives. But what opportunities do you think exist for individuals to participate and contribute to the growth of green economies?
On the individual side, what I think is important for once, think about what you use. And so when you think about electricity and you think about water, try to minimize your footprint, because not using means you already preserve. So be mindful, be not wasting. I think it's one important part. On the other hand, as we discussed before, recycling is very important. So also ensure, that you don't dump your stuff on the side of the road, because it's just not the right thing to do. And when you go shopping, you can have a massive impact on what you put into your basket. So try to avoid products with a lot of plastic around, because plastic is a product which is made from oil. And when you go into the shops, you often see that it's not recycled. It's made from new material. because it's still cheaper to make new plastic than recycled plastic. And if you think about specifically the plastic industry produces as much CO2 than the whole global aviation industry.
I think that's where we wrap the show up for today. Thank you so much, Sabine, for joining me on this episode. Was Sabine Dall'Omo, CEO for Siemens Sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you so much for joining me in studio, Sabine. I've been your host, Buitemela Masike, and I hope you tune in again next time. See you then.